Hey guys, tonight we begin with the brutal, back-breaking, and surprisingly dangerous world of medieval cooking, where a single mistake could poison a king, a poorly timed meal could cost you your head, and your kitchen was basically a death trap wrapped in smoke and grease. While Hollywood makes it look quaint with rosy-cheeked servants stirring bubbling pots, the truth is being a medieval cook seriously sucked. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You've just woken up at 4 a.m. in a stone kitchen that's colder than a tomb. There's no coffee, no electric lights, and definitely no safety regulations. Your job today is to feed anywhere from 50 to 300 people using nothing but fire, iron pots, and whatever didn't spoil overnight. Oh, and if you mess up the Lord's breakfast, you might find yourself locked in the stocks. Or worse, welcome to medieval cooking, where every meal was a high-stakes gamble, and your kitchen was basically a medieval obstacle course designed to maim you. Let's be clear about something. Nobody in medieval times woke up and said, "You know what sounds fun? Standing over an open fire for 16 hours while dodging flying grease and trying not to burn down the castle." Becoming a cook wasn't a career choice, it was survival. Most medieval cooks were either born into kitchen families, sold into service as children, or desperate enough to take any job that came with regular meals. Because in a world where starvation was always lurking around the corner, working in a kitchen meant you'd probably eat every day. Probably. If you were a peasant, you cooked simple gruel and hoped for the best. But if you were unlucky enough to work in a noble's kitchen, congratulations. You'd just signed up for culinary boot camp run by sadistic drill sergeants who happened to wear aprons. The pressure was unreal. One undercooked piece of meat served to the wrong person could trigger a diplomatic incident. One oversalted soup could convince your lord that you were trying to poison him. And heaven help you if you served spoiled food during a feast. That wasn't just embarrassing. That was potentially fatal for everyone involved, including you. Your training, if you could call it that, consisted of being screamed at by the head cook while desperately trying not to set yourself on fire. There were no culinary schools, no gentle mentors teaching you knife skills, and absolutely no health and safety courses. You learned by watching, copying, and praying you didn't accidentally kill someone with your inexperience. Most apprentice cooks spent their first year just trying to figure out which end of a knife to hold and how to start a fire without burning their eyebrows off. The medieval kitchen wasn't some cozy farmhouse scene with herbs hanging from the rafters and bread cooling on windowsills. It was a stone chamber of horrors that looked like it was designed by someone who really hated cooks. Picture a large windowless room with massive fireplaces that belched smoke into your lungs with every breath. The floor was usually dirt or rough stone, slippery with grease, water, and things you really didn't want to identify. Drainage was basically non-existent, so everything just pooled in corners and fermented into medieval biohazards. The ceiling was low and blackened with soot from years of cooking fires. Massive iron pots hung from chains over open flames, swaying dangerously whenever someone bumped into them. Wooden tables were scarred from decades of chopping, stained with blood and grease and probably harbouring enough bacteria to kill a small army. And lighting? Forget about it. You had flickering candles, oil lamps that smoked worse than the fireplaces, and whatever dim light managed to sneak through the occasional arrow slits. Storage was a nightmare. Meat hung from hooks in dark corners where rats could nibble at it freely. Grain was kept in sacks that mice loved to explore. Vegetables were piled in baskets that turned into compost heaps if you weren't careful. And everything, absolutely everything, was constantly under assault from insects, rodents, and the general decay that comes with having no refrigeration in a world where preservation meant salt, smoke, and prayer. Your workspace was shared with chickens wandering around, pecking at scraps, dogs hoping for dropped food, and cats that were supposed to catch mice, but mostly just knock things over. The whole place smelled like a mixture of wood smoke, rancid fat, spoiled vegetables, and whatever the previous cook had burned yesterday. It was hot in summer, freezing in winter, and smoky all year round. Working in a medieval kitchen was like trying to cook a gourmet meal inside a poorly ventilated cave that someone had set on fire. And don't even think about running water. If you needed water for cooking, you either sent someone to the well with buckets or hoped it had rained recently enough to fill the cistern. Every drop was precious, which meant cleaning was optional and hygiene was basically a foreign concept. Let's talk about your daily schedule, which was less of a schedule and more of a marathon sprint through culinary hell. You started before dawn, around 4 in the morning, because fires took time to build, and you needed hours to prepare for the day's first meal. In the pitch darkness, you'd stumble around trying to rekindle the fires from the previous night's embers, assuming they hadn't died completely. If they had, congratulations, you got to start from scratch with flint, steel, and a lot of very creative cursing. By 5, you needed fires blazing and water heating because breakfast for the household wasn't optional. And we're not talking about serving cornflakes to a nuclear family. Medieval noble households could include anywhere from 50 to several hundred people, all expecting to be fed at specific times, whether you were ready or not. The lord and his family ate first, obviously, followed by important guests, then household staff in order of importance. Miss the timing and you'd hear about it, loudly. Your morning started with checking what hadn't spoiled overnight. Meat needed to be sniffed, vegetables examined for rot, and grain checked for weevils. Anything questionable had to be salvaged if possible, or discarded if it was beyond hope. But here's the thing. In a world where waste could mean starvation, very little was considered truly beyond hope. You learned to cut around the mouldy bits, scrape off the green parts, and convince yourself that slightly rancid meat just had character. Breakfast was usually bread, ale, and whatever protein you could scrounge up. Simple enough, except that bread had to be baked fresh daily, ale had to be kept from going sour, and protein meant dealing with live animals that really didn't want to become breakfast. After the morning meal, you immediately started preparing for dinner, the main meal of the day, which was served around noon. This was the big show, especially if there were guests or important occasions. Dinner meant multiple courses, elaborate presentations, and enough food to impress or intimidate, depending on the political situation. You might be roasting whole pigs, preparing elaborate meat pies, or creating sugar sculptures that were more art than food. Every dish had to be perfect, properly seasoned, and served at exactly the right temperature, which was challenging when your only heat source was an open fire, and your only timing device was the position of the sun. After dinner, you cleaned up while simultaneously preparing for supper, a lighter evening meal. Then you banked the fires, secured the food stores, and collapsed somewhere around 10 at night, if you were lucky. 16-hour days were normal. 18-hour days were common during feasts or holidays, and there were no days off. Medieval kitchens operated 7 days a week because people had this annoying habit of wanting to eat every single day. Your tools were basically Iron Age technology with a medieval twist. You had knives that were hand-forged, never quite sharp enough, and prone to breaking at the worst possible moments. Cutting boards were slabs of wood that absorbed every smell, stain, and bacteria you could imagine. Pots were massive iron cauldrons that took 2 people to lift when full and conducted heat, about as well as you'd expect from medieval metallurgy. Spoons were carved from wood and constantly splitting. Forks hadn't been invented yet for most of the medieval period, so you had knives, spoons, and your hands. That's it. Everything else was improvisation and hope. Need to strain something? Find some cloth and pray it doesn't tear. Need to measure ingredients, guess and adjust, based on how things looked, smelled, or tasted. Your stove was an open hearth with iron bars or hooks to hang pots over the flames. Temperature control meant moving pots closer or further from the fire, adding or removing logs, and developing an almost supernatural ability to judge heat by holding your hand near the flames. Too hot and you burned everything. Too cool and nothing cooked properly. There was no middle ground, no even heating, and absolutely no margin for error. Ovens existed in larger kitchens, but they were massive stone or brick affairs that took hours to heat properly. You'd build a fire inside the oven chamber, let it burn until the stones were scorching hot, then rake out the coals and slide in your bread or pies. The residual heat did the cooking, which meant you had one shot to get the timing right. Too early and nothing cooked, too late and everything burned. It was medieval roulette with carbohydrates. And then there were the specialised tools that were more like medieval torture devices. Meat jacks for turning roasts over the fire, usually operated by small children who sat in the sweltering heat, cranking handles for hours. Mortar and pestles for grinding spices that were bigger than some modern furniture. And flesh hooks, which were exactly what they sound like, giant hooks for pulling meat out of boiling cauldrons without falling face first into the pot. Everything was heavy, unwieldy, and designed by people who apparently believed that cooking should be a full contact sport. Your hands were constantly burned, cut, or both. Your back ached from leaning over fires and lifting iron pots, and your lungs were slowly being destroyed by years of breathing smoke and grease vapour. But here's the thing that really made medieval cooking a nightmare. You weren't just fighting the tools, the schedule, and the working conditions. You were fighting the food itself. Because medieval food was actively trying to kill you and everyone else. Let's start with meat, which was less of an ingredient and more of a biological weapon waiting to happen. There was no refrigeration, no understanding of bacteria, and absolutely no concept of sell-by dates. Fresh meat was great if you could get it, but fresh was a relative term when the animal might have been slaughtered days ago and hung in a warm room ever since. You learned to identify the stages of decay like a forensic scientist. There was fresh, which smelled like meat. There was gamey, which smelled strong but wasn't necessarily dangerous. There was questionable, which meant you'd better cook it thoroughly and pray. And there was dangerous, which meant even the dogs wouldn't touch it. The problem was, the line between questionable and dangerous wasn't always clear, and guessing wrong could poison half the household. Salt was your best friend for preservation, but it was expensive and not always available, so you used every trick in the book, smoking meat over fires that had to be constantly tended, packing it in salt if you could afford it, submerging it in brine barrels that attracted every fly within miles, or just cooking it immediately and hoping someone would eat it before it went bad. But here's where it gets really fun. Medieval people had some creative ideas about food safety. They believed that if meat was going bad, you could fix it by washing it in wine or vinegar. Spoiler alert, that doesn't work. They thought that cooking spoiled meat long enough would make it safe. Also wrong. And they were convinced that adding enough spices could mask the taste and smell of rotten food. Technically, true, but it doesn't stop you from dying horribly. Spices weren't just flavour enhancers, they were medieval antibiotics that didn't actually work. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, these weren't seasonings, they were desperate attempts to make spoiled food edible. The more expensive the spice, the more magical properties people attributed to it. Saffron wasn't just added for colour, it was supposed to cure everything from depression to plague. It didn't, but it made the food look fancy while you slowly poisoned yourself. Vegetables weren't much safer. Without proper storage, they rotted quickly in warm weather and froze solid in winter. Root vegetables like turnips and parsnips could last longer, but they were usually stored in cellars that were also home to rats, mice, and various creeping things that liked to nibble. By spring, your stored vegetables were either sprouting, rotting, or had been partially eaten by creatures you really didn't want to think about. Grain was a constant battle against weevils, mice, and moisture. You'd open a sack of flour and find it crawling with insects. Medieval bakers just sifted them out and kept going. A little extra protein never hurt anyone, right? Wrong again. Those insects carried diseases, and mouldy grain could contain ergot, a fungus that caused hallucinations, convulsions, and death. But hey, at least the bread was interesting. Dairy products were playing Russian roulette with bacteria. Milk spoiled within hours in warm weather. Cheese was safer because the aging process killed some harmful bacteria, but it also attracted others. You never really knew if that wheel of cheese was perfectly aged or a biological weapon. Butter was churned from cream that might have been sitting around for days, then stored in containers that weren't exactly sterile. And then there was water. Oh, the water. Medieval water sources were contaminated with everything you can imagine, and several things you really don't want to. Wells were often located downhill from latrines. Rivers were used for drinking, washing, and disposing of waste, sometimes simultaneously. Even when water looked clean, it was probably teeming with parasites and bacteria that would make modern health inspectors weep. That's why everyone drank ale, including children. Not because they were alcoholics, but because the brewing process killed most of the harmful microorganisms. Beer was safer than water, which tells you everything you need to know about medieval hygiene standards. Of course, this meant that half your kitchen staff was slightly drunk most of the time, which didn't exactly improve their knife skills or fire safety awareness. But the real nightmare was cooking for special occasions. Regular daily meals were stressful enough, but feasts were culinary warfare. Picture this: the Lord is hosting a political dinner for rival nobles who might declare war if the food isn't impressive enough. You're expected to produce a meal that demonstrates wealth, power, and sophistication, using ingredients that might kill everyone if prepared incorrectly. Medieval feast menus were insane. Multiple courses with dozens of dishes each, roasted peacocks presented with their feathers reattached, elaborate meat pies shaped like castles, live birds hidden inside other roasted birds that would fly out when carved, sugar sculptures that cost more than most people's annual income, and everything had to be served simultaneously while still hot. The logistics were a nightmare. You needed multiple fires at different temperatures. Dozens of pots and pans all being used at once, teams of assistants who may or may not know what they're doing, and perfect timing so that the Lord's trencher received the first portion of every dish while it was still at optimal temperature. One mistake could ruin everything. Burn the main roast and you've insulted your guests. Undersalt the soup and you've demonstrated incompetence. Serve anything even slightly spoiled and you might accidentally start a war. The pressure was so intense that head cooks were known to collapse from stress during major feasts, and God forbid there were dietary restrictions or special requests. Medieval nobles had opinions about food that bordered on superstition. Some believed certain combinations of foods were poisonous, others insisted on specific preparation methods that made no sense. Religious dietary laws added another layer of complexity, especially during Lent when meat was forbidden, and you had to get creative with fish, vegetables, and whatever else the church approved of. The worst part was that you were working with seasonal ingredients in a world without global trade. Want citrus fruits in winter? Too bad. Need fresh vegetables in March? Hope you stored enough last autumn? Craving tropical spices? Better hope the last trading caravan didn't get robbed by bandits. You cooked with whatever was available locally, whatever had survived storage, and whatever you could afford with the kitchen budget. Speaking of budgets, medieval kitchen economics were brutal. Food costs fluctuated wildly, based on harvests, weather, and political stability. A bad harvest could triple the price of grain overnight. A war could cut off trade routes and make spices impossible to obtain. And throughout all of this chaos, you were expected to maintain the same quality and variety of meals, regardless of circumstances. You learned to be creative with leftovers because waste was unthinkable. Yesterday's roast became today's meat pie. Stale bread became breadcrumbs or trenchers. Vegetable scraps became soup stock. Bones were boiled until they dissolved to extract every bit of nutrition. Nothing was thrown away if it could possibly be repurposed, recycled, or disguised as something more appealing, But creativity had its limits when your ingredients were actively fighting back. Meat that was too far gone couldn't be saved by clever seasoning. Vegetables that had turned to mush couldn't be disguised in a pie. And when your core ingredients were compromised, your entire menu became a house of cards built on culinary desperation. The truth is, medieval cooking wasn't just about preparing food. It was about survival, politics, and constant improvisation in the face of impossible challenges. Every meal was a small miracle of logistics, timing, and sheer stubborn determination. And if you managed to serve something edible without poisoning anyone or burning down the kitchen, well, that was considered a successful day. But we're just getting started on why you wouldn't last a day as a medieval cook, because we haven't even talked about the animals yet. The live animals that you had to personally transform from barnyard residents into dinner. And trust me, they weren't going quietly. Now let's talk about the part of medieval cooking that would probably send you running back to your modern kitchen faster than a plague outbreak: the animals. Because in medieval times you didn't just cook meat, you met your dinner personally, looked it in the eye, and then figured out how to turn it from a living, breathing creature into something edible. And let me tell you, medieval livestock had attitude. Your morning routine didn't start with opening a refrigerator and pulling out a nice, clean package of ground beef. It started with walking into the barnyard with a knife and choosing which chicken was about to have a very bad day. Chickens, by the way, are not cooperative about becoming dinner. They run, they flap, they make horrible noises, and they have an uncanny ability to sense exactly what you're planning. Ever tried to catch a terrified chicken in a medieval courtyard while wearing long robes and carrying a sharp knife? It's like playing the world's most dangerous game of tag. But chickens were the easy part. Let's talk about pigs. Medieval pigs weren't the cute, pink farm animals you see in children's books. They were semi-feral beasts that could weigh 300 pounds and had attitudes to match. They were smart, strong, and absolutely convinced that you were not going to turn them into bacon without a fight. Slaughtering a pig was a community event because it took multiple people to restrain an animal that could easily knock you unconscious with one well-placed kick. And the process was horrifying. No quick, humane methods, no stunning guns or precise cuts. You had to physically overpower the animal, hold it down, and then try to kill it quickly enough that it didn't suffer unnecessarily, while also making sure you didn't get trampled in the process. Blood went everywhere. The animals screamed, other livestock got agitated, and you had to do all of this while maintaining some semblance of sanitation, because this blood-covered carcass was going to feed people later. Cattle were even worse. A full-grown cow or ox could weigh over 1,000 pounds and had the strength to literally kill you if the slaughter went wrong. You needed specialised tools, multiple assistants, and a good understanding of anatomy to bring down something that large. Plus, cattle were expensive. Mess up the slaughter of a cow, and you hadn't just ruined dinner, you'd destroyed a significant portion of the household's wealth. But here's the part that would really mess with your head. Medieval people didn't have the luxury of emotional distance from their food. That pig you slaughtered for Christmas dinner, you'd been feeding it scraps and watching it grow for months. The chickens you killed for Sunday roast, you'd collected their eggs every morning. The sheep that became mutton stew, you'd helped shear its wool just a few months earlier. Modern people can buy a burger without thinking about the cow it came from. Medieval cooks didn't have that option. You knew every animal personally. You'd named some of them. You'd watched them grow from babies into adults. And then you had to look them in the eye and turn them into dinner. It was emotionally brutal in ways that modern people can't really comprehend. And the timing was critical. Animals had to be slaughtered at exactly the right moment. Too young, and there wasn't enough meat. Too old, and the meat was tough and stringy. The weather mattered too. Slaughter in hot weather, and the meat spoiled before you could preserve it. Slaughter in freezing weather, and you risked the carcass freezing solid before you could properly butcher it. Then came the butchering, which was an art form that took years to master. You had to know exactly where to cut to separate joints, how to remove organs without contaminating the meat, and which parts were edible versus which parts would kill you. Medieval anatomy knowledge was sketchy at best, so you learned through trial and error meant potentially poisoning the entire household. Every part of the animal had to be used because waste was unthinkable. The meat was obvious, but you also had to deal with organs, blood, bones, hide, and various other bits that modern people would never consider food. Liver, kidneys, heart, brain, tongue, intestines for sausage casings, blood for blood pudding, bones for soup stock, and hide for leather. Nothing was thrown away if it could possibly be used, but processing all these parts required different techniques and timing. Blood had to be used immediately, or it coagulated into useless clumps. Organs spoiled faster than regular meat, and had to be cooked first. Intestines had to be cleaned thoroughly, which was exactly as disgusting as it sounds. And every step of the process was a potential source of contamination that could make people violently ill. The smell was indescribable. Imagine the metallic scent of fresh blood mixed with the barnyard odours of frightened animals, the earthy smell of intestinal contents, and the sweet clawing odour of raw meat in warm weather. It clung to your clothes, your hair, your skin. Medieval cooks smelled like a combination of butcher shop and battlefield, and no amount of washing could completely remove it. And let's not forget about preservation. You couldn't just slaughter an animal and stick the leftover meat in a freezer. Everything had to be preserved immediately using salt, smoke, or other methods that were time-consuming and required constant attention. Smoking meat meant tending fires for days or weeks. Salting required expensive salt and careful monitoring to prevent spoilage. And even with preservation, you were always racing against time and bacteria. But the real nightmare was cooking these freshly butchered animals over open fires with medieval equipment. Roasting a whole pig on a spit sounds romantic until you realise that pig weighs 200 pounds. The spit is a heavy iron rod that takes multiple people to turn, and the fire has to be maintained at exactly the right temperature for 8 to 12 hours straight. The pig had to be turned constantly to cook evenly, which meant someone had to stand in the blazing heat, cranking a handle all day long, and that someone was usually you or one of your assistants. Medieval kitchens didn't have automatic rotisseries. They had human-powered ones. Children were often assigned to turn spits because they were small enough to sit close to the fire, and their wages were basically food and shelter. These kids would spend entire days in sweltering heat, turning handles until their arms went numb, breathing smoke and grease vapour while trying not to fall asleep and let the meat burn. The larger the animal, the more complex the cooking became. A whole ox required a fire pit, multiple spits, and a team of people working in shifts. The logistics were insane. You needed enough firewood to maintain intense heat for an entire day. You needed basting brushes to keep the meat moist, which were usually just bundles of herbs tied to sticks. You needed to calculate cooking times based on guesswork and experience, because there were no thermometers or timers. And throughout this entire process, you were constantly fighting against the elements. Wind could blow your fire in the wrong direction, sending smoke and sparks everywhere. Rain could dampen your firewood and lower the temperature just enough to ruin hours of work. Snow could make it impossible to maintain consistent heat. You were literally cooking outdoors in all weather conditions with no protection, except maybe a crude lean-to shelter. The worst part was that all this effort could be undone by a single mistake. Let the fire get too hot and the outside burned while the inside stayed raw. Let it get too cool and bacteria started growing in the partially cooked meat. Turn the spit too slowly and one side overcooked while the other stayed bloody. Turn it too fast and the meat fell apart from the motion, and every mistake was public. When you're roasting a whole animal for a feast, everyone can see what you're doing. The Lord, his guests, the household staff, they're all watching and waiting for their dinner. There's no hiding a burned roast or covering up undercooked meat. Your failures were on full display for everyone to judge. But let's say everything went perfectly. The animal was slaughtered cleanly, butchered properly, and cooked to perfection. You still had to carve it and serve it while it was hot, which was another skill entirely. Medieval carving was a ceremonial art performed in front of the assembled diners. You had to know the proper order for serving different cuts, the correct way to present each portion, and how to make it look elegant, even though you were essentially dismembering a carcass with a knife. The carver was often a specialised position, separate from the cook, because it required not just culinary skill, but social grace. You had to serve the Lord first, then guests in order of importance, then household staff according to their rank. Make a mistake in the serving order, and you just committed a social blunder that could have political consequences. And timing was everything. Medieval feasts weren't casual affairs where people wandered in and grabbed food when they felt like it. Everyone was seated according to strict protocols, and the food had to arrive at exactly the right moment. Too early, and it sat cooling while people finished their conversations. Too late, and you'd kept important guests waiting, which was a serious insult. So there you were, sweating over multiple fires, coordinating teams of assistants, trying to time everything perfectly, while dealing with animals that didn't want to cooperate, equipment that barely worked, and ingredients that were actively trying to spoil, all while knowing that a single mistake could result in food poisoning, political embarrassment, or even accusations of attempted murder. And we haven't even talked about the truly exotic requests yet. Medieval nobles had some very specific ideas about what constituted impressive food. They wanted peacocks roasted and then reassembled with their feathers. They wanted elaborate meat pies shaped like castles with multiple types of animals inside. They wanted live birds that would fly out when certain dishes were cut open. These weren't just meals, they were theatrical performances that required the skills of a cook, an engineer, and a magician all rolled into one. Imagine trying to stuff a roasted chicken inside a roasted duck, inside a roasted goose, ensuring that all three birds cooked properly without any of them becoming overcooked or undercooked, or attempting to build a pie crust sturdy enough to hold its shape, while looking like a miniature fortress, complete with towers and battlements. These culinary stunts required precision, artistry, and probably a fair amount of luck. The pressure was relentless because medieval cooking wasn't just about nutrition. It was about politics, social status, and power displays. A successful feast could cement alliances, impress rivals, and demonstrate wealth. A failed feast could result in diplomatic incidents, social humiliation, and economic consequences. You weren't just feeding people, you were managing international relations one meal at a time. And all of this happened in conditions that would horrify modern health inspectors. Raw meat sitting at room temperature for hours, blood pooling on surfaces that hadn't been properly cleaned, smoke and grease covering everything in a film of potential contamination, animals being slaughtered in the same area where food was prepared. It was a bacterial paradise that somehow didn't kill everyone immediately, though it certainly killed plenty of people slowly. The mental toll was enormous. You were constantly stressed about timing, worried about spoilage, exhausted from the physical demands, and emotionally drained from the endless cycle of raising, killing, and cooking animals. Sleep was minimal during busy periods, breaks were non-existent, and the knowledge that people's lives literally depended on your skills created a level of pressure that would break most modern people. But perhaps the most challenging aspect was the complete lack of standardization. There were no recipes in the modern sense, no precise measurements, no cooking temperatures, and no timing guides. Everything was based on experience, intuition, and tradition, passed down through generations of cooks who had learned through trial and error. You estimated quantities by handfuls and pinches. You judged doneness by colour, smell, and texture. You timed everything by the position of the sun or the length of prayers. This meant that every meal was essentially an experiment. You might have cooked the same dish hundreds of times, but slight variations in ingredients, weather, fire temperature, or timing could produce completely different results. Consistency was nearly impossible to achieve, which made planning elaborate menus a nightmare of logistics and probability. Medieval cooking was less of a profession and more of a survival skill that required the physical endurance of an athlete, the patience of a saint, and the nerves of a bomb disposal expert. You were working with dangerous tools, toxic ingredients, and volatile fires while under constant pressure to produce perfect results with imperfect methods. And the crazy part is, this was considered normal. This was just how food was prepared for hundreds of years. Generations of cooks lived and died in these conditions, somehow managing to feed entire households without modern conveniences, safety equipment, or basic sanitation. They developed techniques and traditions that kept people fed despite overwhelming challenges. But knowing that people survived it doesn't make it any less brutal. The medieval kitchen was a place where burns, cuts, and food poisoning were daily hazards, where exhaustion was chronic and stress was constant, where a single mistake could literally be deadly for you and everyone you served. So the next time you complain about your modern kitchen being too small or your oven taking too long to preheat, remember the medieval cook standing over an open fire at 4 a.m, trying to turn a live pig into dinner while avoiding death by smoke inhalation, grease burns, or accidental stabbing. Your worst cooking disaster is nothing compared to what they faced every single day. But we're still not done exploring this culinary nightmare, because we haven't talked about what happened when things went really wrong, when the food actually did poison people, when political tensions exploded over a poorly cooked meal, when you discovered that someone in your kitchen might be trying to kill your lord, when cooking became a matter of life, death, and medieval justice, when things went catastrophically wrong in a medieval kitchen, and trust me, they did. The consequences weren't just embarrassing, they were deadly. Not just for the people who ate the food, but for you, the cook who prepared it. Because in a world where poisoning was a legitimate political strategy and accidents looked suspiciously like assassination attempts, serving bad food could get you tortured, executed, or both. Let's start with the obvious nightmare scenario. Food poisoning. In modern times, if you give someone food poisoning, they get sick, maybe go to the hospital, and you feel terrible about it. In medieval times, if you gave someone food poisoning, you were immediately suspected of attempted murder, because how was anyone supposed to tell the difference between accidental spoilage and deliberate poisoning? Spoiler alert, they couldn't. Medieval nobles lived in constant fear of assassination, and poison was the weapon of choice for political enemies who couldn't challenge them to open combat. So when Lord Edmund suddenly started vomiting blood after eating your mutton stew, nobody assumed you'd just used meat that was a little too ripe. They assumed you were a hired assassin, trying to eliminate their master with a strategically placed piece of rotten lamb. The investigation process was about as scientific as you'd expect from people who thought bathing caused disease. First, they'd interrogate you, which in medieval terms meant torture until you confessed to something, anything, just to make the pain stop. Then they'd test your remaining food on prisoners or animals to see if it killed them too. If it did, congratulations, you were definitely guilty of attempted murder. If it didn't, well, maybe you were just an incompetent cook, but they'd probably torture you some more, just to be sure. The really fun part was that medieval medicine couldn't distinguish between different types of illness. Dysentery, food poisoning, plague, stomach flu. They all looked the same to people whose idea of medical diagnosis involved checking your urine's colour and consulting the stars. So if someone got sick after eating your food, even if it was completely unrelated to what you'd served, guess who was getting blamed? And it wasn't just about nobles. If you poisoned a bunch of servants or soldiers, that was sabotage. You were weakening your lord's household, probably on behalf of his enemies. The punishment for that was usually death, often preceded by creative torture designed to extract confessions about who had hired you and what other evil plots you were involved in. But here's where it gets really twisted. Sometimes the food wasn't actually bad. Sometimes people got sick for completely unrelated reasons. But since they'd eaten recently, obviously it must have been the food. Medieval people had no understanding of germs, viruses, or infection. If you got sick, it was because of something you ate, something you did wrong, or divine punishment for your sins. The cook was always the most convenient scapegoat. Even worse, political enemies could deliberately frame you. Slip some actual poison into food after you'd prepared it, wait for the inevitable deaths, then point fingers at the obvious culprit. You'd be tortured into confessing to crimes you didn't commit, executed for murders you didn't plan, and remembered as a traitor who betrayed your Lord's trust, all because someone else used your kitchen as cover for their assassination plot. The paranoia was so intense that many noble households employed food tasters, servants whose job was to eat small portions of every dish before it was served to anyone important. These people were basically human canaries, living early warning systems for poisoned food. If the taster dropped dead or started convulsing, dinner was cancelled and the cook was arrested. If the taster survived, the food was probably safe, though you never really knew, because some poisons worked slowly. Food tasters were usually volunteers from the lower ranks of household staff, people desperate enough to risk their lives for slightly better pay and living conditions. They'd eat a bite of everything, wait a few minutes to see if they started dying, then give the all-clear signal. It was Russian roulette with medieval cuisine, and these people played it multiple times every day, but even food tasters couldn't protect you from accusations of attempted poisoning. Maybe the poison was designed to work slowly. Maybe it only affected certain people. Maybe you'd bribed the taster to pretend the food was safe. Medieval paranoia was creative and thorough, and once suspicion fell on you, proving your innocence was nearly impossible. The political implications were staggering. A single case of food poisoning could trigger diplomatic incidents, trade wars, or actual military conflicts. If a visiting ambassador got sick after eating at your lord's table, it could be interpreted as an act of war. Treaties could be broken, alliances shattered, and armies mobilized because someone served spoiled fish to the wrong person at the wrong time. And the social dynamics made everything worse. If you were a peasant cook serving noble diners, the class differences meant you were automatically suspicious. Why would a low-born servant care about the health of their social superiors? Obviously, you must harbour resentment against the nobles who ruled over you. Obviously, you were probably plotting revolution through strategic food poisoning. The fact that you needed this job to survive was irrelevant. Religious tensions added another layer of complexity. If you were cooking for people of different faiths, any illness could be blamed on religious sabotage. Christian cooks serving Jewish households, Muslim cooks serving Christian nobles. Anyone crossing religious boundaries was walking into a minefield of potential accusations. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was a weapon in the endless religious conflicts that defined medieval politics. The worst part was that you had no legal protections. There were no food safety regulations, no standards of evidence, and no presumption of innocence. If someone important got sick after eating your food, you were guilty until proven innocent. And proving innocence usually involved surviving torture, trial by ordeal, or other methods that were designed more to extract confessions than determine truth. Trial by ordeal was particularly horrifying for accused cooks. You might be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar in your bare hands, then have your wounds examined days later. If they healed cleanly, you were innocent. If they became infected, you were guilty and would be executed. Alternatively, you might be thrown into a river with your hands bound. If you sank, you were innocent, but probably drowned. If you floated, you were guilty of witchcraft and would be burned alive. But let's say you survived the accusations and somehow proved your innocence. Your reputation was still destroyed. Word would spread that you'd been suspected of poisoning, and no other household would hire you. You'd be marked as potentially dangerous for the rest of your life, unemployable in any position that involved handling food. Your career was over, your future ruined, all because someone got a stomachache after dinner. The fear of accusation shaped everything about how medieval cooks worked. You tasted everything obsessively, not just to check seasoning but to prove you weren't trying to poison anyone. You invited witnesses to watch you prepare important meals. You kept detailed mental notes about where every ingredient came from and how it was stored. You lived in constant terror that something would go wrong and you'd be blamed for it. Paranoia became a survival skill. You watched your assistants constantly, making sure nobody added anything to the food without your knowledge. You locked up spices and valuable ingredients not just to prevent theft, but to prevent tampering. You developed elaborate procedures for testing meat, checking vegetables, and verifying that everything was safe before it went into the pot. And yet, despite all these precautions, accidents still happened. Meat spoiled unexpectedly. Vegetables harboured dangerous parasites. Grain contained toxic molds. Storage containers leaked, allowing contamination. Wild animals got into food stores. Weather changes affected preservation methods. 1,000 things could go wrong, and when they did, you were the one who paid the price. The psychological toll was enormous. You lived with the constant knowledge that a single mistake could result in your death. Every meal was a potential execution warrant. Every sick diner was a potential accuser. Every unusual request was a potential trap. The stress was relentless, the fear omnipresent, and the margin for error non-existent. Some cooks cracked under the pressure. They'd flee in the middle of the night, abandoning their positions rather than face another day of potential accusations. Others became obsessively cautious, testing and retesting everything until meals were delayed for hours. Still others turned to drink, trying to numb their anxiety with ale until they were too drunk to cook safely. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect was the arbitrary nature of medieval justice. Your fate often depended less on what actually happened and more on the political climate, your lord's mood, and the social dynamics of the moment. A lord who trusted you might protect you from accusations. A lord who was under political pressure might sacrifice you to appease critics. A lord who was paranoid might see poison plots everywhere and execute cooks preemptively. The same mistake that got you a stern warning on Tuesday might get you tortured and executed on Wednesday if the political situation had changed. There was no consistency, no predictable consequences, no way to know whether you'd survive your next shift in the kitchen. You were completely at the mercy of forces beyond your control, living one meal away from disaster. And remember, this was happening in a world where communication was slow and unreliable. News of your execution might not reach your family for weeks or months. Your name would be associated with treachery and poison, ruining the reputations of your relatives and making it impossible for them to find work. Your death wouldn't just end your life, it would destroy your entire bloodline's future prospects. The irony was that the very skills that made you valuable as a cook also made you dangerous as a potential assassin. Knowledge of herbs and spices meant you might know which ones were poisonous. Understanding of preservation meant you could hide the taste of toxins. Access to the Lord's food meant you had opportunity to strike. The more skilled you became, the more suspicious you appeared. This created a horrible catch-22. To be a successful cook, you needed extensive knowledge of ingredients, preservation methods, and culinary techniques. But that same knowledge made you a prime suspect whenever someone got sick. Excellence in your profession automatically made you a security threat, monitored and mistrusted by the very people you served. Medieval kitchens weren't just workplaces, they were potential crime scenes under constant surveillance. Every action was watched, every ingredient monitored, every decision scrutinized for signs of treachery. You worked under the assumption that you were probably guilty of something, and that proving your innocence was your daily responsibility. The paranoia was so pervasive that it affected how food was prepared, served, and consumed. Elaborate rituals developed around meal preparation, designed more to prevent poisoning than to improve flavour. Multiple people handled each dish, making it harder for any single person to introduce toxins. Ingredients were sourced from multiple suppliers to prevent systematic contamination. Meals were prepared in full view of witnesses whenever possible. But all these precautions created new problems. Multiple handlers increased the risk of accidental contamination. Diverse ingredient sources made it harder to track quality and freshness. Public preparation meant that any mistakes were immediately visible to critics and potential accusers. The cure became almost as dangerous as the disease, and through it all, you still had to produce delicious, impressive meals that met the social and political expectations of your position. You couldn't just serve safe, bland food and call it a day. The meals had to demonstrate your lord's wealth, power, and sophistication. They had to impress guests, intimidate rivals, and maintain the household's reputation, all while avoiding accidental poisoning, deliberate sabotage, and political controversy. It was an impossible balancing act that required not just culinary skill, but political awareness, social intelligence, and nerves of steel. You had to be a cook, a diplomat, a detective, and a survivor all at once. One moment of inattention, one poor decision, one stroke of bad luck could end everything. So the next time you worry about overcooking a steak or burning dinner, remember the medieval cook who faced execution every time someone got indigestion. Your worst kitchen disaster is a minor inconvenience compared to what they endured every single day. Because in their world, cooking wasn't just about creating food. It was about navigating a minefield of political intrigue, social paranoia, and medieval justice, where the penalty for failure wasn't just embarrassment, it was death. So there you have it, the brutal, terrifying, absolutely miserable world of the medieval cook. A job where you woke up before dawn to face fires that could kill you, animals that fought back, ingredients that were actively trying to poison everyone, and the constant threat that one bad meal could literally cost you your head. You wouldn't last a day, not because you're weak or incompetent, but because you're used to a world where food safety is regulated, where ingredients come with expiration dates, where cooking fires don't fill your lungs with toxic smoke, and where serving undercooked chicken gets you a bad Yelp review instead of a public execution. The medieval cook survived in conditions that would horrify modern health inspectors, using tools that would be banned by every safety organisation on earth, working hours that would violate every labour law ever written. They lived with burns, cuts, smoke inhalation, and the constant fear that their next meal might be their last. Not because they'd eat something bad, but because they'd accidentally serve something bad to someone who could have them tortured to death for it. They were part chef, part butcher, part chemist, part diplomat, and part gladiator, fighting daily battles against spoilage, fire, political intrigue, and their own exhaustion. They kept entire households fed, using nothing but determination, experience passed down through generations, and an almost supernatural ability to turn barely edible ingredients into something that wouldn't kill everyone. And somehow, against all odds, they succeeded. They fed kings and peasants, hosted elaborate feasts, and created culinary traditions that lasted for centuries. They did it without refrigeration, without thermometers, without safety equipment, and without any of the conveniences we take for granted today. But don't romanticize it. Don't imagine cozy kitchens with herbs hanging from the rafters and friendly cooks humming while they worked. The medieval kitchen was a place of smoke and blood, sweat and terror, where survival meant being tougher than the ingredients you cooked and smarter than the people trying to frame you for murder. So tonight, when you flip on your electric stove, open your refrigerator, or complain about having to defrost something in the microwave, take a moment to appreciate just how good you have it. Because somewhere in the mists of history, a medieval cook is looking at your kitchen and thinking it's paradise. And honestly, they'd be right.